This story was sent in by a guy named Caleb, who lives up in the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the forests are thick, the history is deep, and the secrets are even deeper. This all went down back in the late fall of 2019, just before the first real bite of winter hit. I've always been a woodsman, grew up with the smell of pine needles in my nostrils and the crunch of leaves under my boots. My family's been in these mountains for generations, living off the land, hunting, fishing, and just generally keeping to ourselves. We respect the woods, and for the most part, they respect us back. Every year, around late November, I take a solo hunting trip. It's a tradition, something my old man did, and his old man before him. I head up to the old family cabin, a place so remote you can't even get cell service, and spend a week tracking deer, enjoying the silence, and just reconnecting with nature. It's my way of hitting the reset button before the chaos of the holidays. This particular year, 2019, started like any other. I packed up my truck, a beat-up old Ford that's seen more dirt roads than pavement, with supplies, canned goods, jerky, water, a first aid kit, my trusty rifle, and enough ammo to take down a small army. I told my wife, Sarah, I loved her, kissed my 2 little girls goodbye, and set off. The drive up is always a journey. You leave the paved roads behind, then the gravel, and finally, you're on these narrow, winding dirt tracks that seem to disappear into the trees. The air gets colder, the trees get taller, and the silence gets heavier. It's a beautiful kind of isolation, one that I usually crave. The cabin itself is nothing fancy. 1 room, a wood-burning stove, a creaky old bed, and a porch that overlooks a valley. It's got no electricity, no running water, but it's got character. It's home, at least for a week each year. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from some distant chimney, probably another old-timer like me, getting ready for the long night. I unloaded my gear, started a fire in the stove, and settled in. The first night was peaceful. I ate a simple dinner, read a few chapters of an old Western novel by the light of a kerosene lamp, and fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, eager to get out into the woods. I brewed some coffee on the stove, strong enough to wake the dead, and stepped out onto the porch. The valley below was shrouded in mist, the trees like ghostly sentinels in the pre-dawn light. It was beautiful, serene, but there was also something different. A stillness that felt a little too still, a silence that was a little too quiet. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. A little bit of nerves was to be expected. I grabbed my rifle, checked the sights, and headed out into the woods. The first day of hunting was uneventful. I saw a few deer, but nothing worth taking. The woods were quiet, almost eerily so. I didn't see any other hunters, which was unusual but not unheard of. I kept moving, following game trails, my senses on high alert. It was late afternoon when I first noticed something was off. I was deep in the woods, following a promising set of tracks, when I came across a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a pile of rocks, arranged in a way that seemed intentional. It wasn't a natural formation, that was for sure. It looked like a cairn, a marker of some kind. Now, I've seen my share of strange things in these woods, old moonshine stills, abandoned homesteads, even the occasional bear den. But this was different. It felt out of place, like someone had deliberately left it there. I circled the cairn, looking for any other signs of human presence, but there was nothing. Just the rocks, the trees, and the growing sense of unease in my gut. I decided to move on, chalking it up to some hiker's attempt at art or maybe a kid messing around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As dusk began to settle, I started making my way back to the cabin. The woods seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, my hand never far from my rifle. I reached the cabin just as the last light faded from the sky. I built up the fire, cooked a quick dinner, and tried to relax. But the feeling of unease lingered. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone or something staring back at me. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind, sounded like a footstep, a whisper. I lay in bed listening to the silence, my mind racing. I started to doubt my decision to come up here alone. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea after all. The next day, the feeling intensified. I went out hunting again, but my heart wasn't in it. I kept finding myself drawn back to that clearing, to that pile of rocks. It was like a magnet pulling me in. When I finally reached the clearing again, the cairn was still there, exactly as I had left it. But this time, there was something else. A small wooden object lying at the base of the rocks. I cautiously approached, my rifle raised. It was a crudely carved figure, about 6 inches tall. It depicted a humanoid shape, but with exaggerated features, long limbs, a large head, and deep-set eyes. It was unsettling, to say the least. It looked ancient, like something out of a Native American legend. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, made from some kind of dark, dense wood. As I examined it, I noticed a faint smell, something earthy and metallic, like blood. That's when I heard it. A twig snapped nearby in the trees. I spun around, my rifle ready, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the silence. I didn't stay in that clearing any longer. I shoved the wooden figure into my pocket and practically ran back to the cabin. I locked the door, checked all the windows, and loaded my rifle. I was officially spooked. The rest of the day was a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I paced the cabin, jumpy at every sound. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night, the real terror began. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the growing darkness within the cabin. I, Caleb, sat there clutching my rifle, the crudely carved figure heavy in my pocket. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, sent shivers down my spine. I was a grown man, a seasoned hunter, but I felt like a scared child, alone in the dark. I tried to distract myself. I stoked the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. I tried to read, but the words blurred together, my mind consumed by the unsettling events of the day. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the howl of the wind. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on you, suffocating you with its intensity. As the hours ticked by, the feeling of being watched intensified. I found myself constantly glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a pair of eyes staring back at me. I even started talking to myself, trying to break the oppressive silence, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. "It's just the wind, Caleb," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Just the wind and the trees, nothing to worry about. But the words felt hollow, unconvincing even to my own ears. Around midnight, the first real sign that something was wrong came. A low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere outside, close to the cabin. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a coyote. It was something else, something primal. My blood ran cold. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles white. I slowly made my way to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the woods in an inky blackness. I could see nothing, but I could feel it. Something was out there, moving in the shadows. Then, another growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging against the side of the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest. I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a place to hide, a way to defend myself. The dragging sound continued, circling the cabin like whatever was out there was sizing up its prey. I could hear the faint scratch of claws on wood, the low growl, a constant menacing presence. I was trapped, isolated, and utterly terrified. I knew I couldn't just stay there, waiting for whatever was out there to break in. I had to do something. I had to take control of the situation. With a deep breath, I grabbed the kerosene lamp, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I lit the wick, the small flame flickering to life, casting a warm glow around the room. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I decided to make a run for it. I would burst out the door, fire a few shots into the air to scare whatever was out there, and then make a beeline for my truck. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance I had. I positioned myself by the door, my rifle in one hand, the lamp in the other. I counted to 3, took another deep breath, and threw the door open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the stench of something foul, something akin to rotting meat. I raised my rifle, firing 2 shots into the air. The sound echoed through the stillness, momentarily drowning out the growls. And then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the porch, bathed in the faint moonlight that filtered through the clouds, was a figure. It was tall, almost 7 feet, and incredibly thin. Its limbs unnaturally long and gangly. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over its bones. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was vaguely human, but distorted, grotesque. Its eyes were large and black, devoid of any pupils or irises. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a creature that shouldn't exist, but did. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. It lunged towards me, its long arms outstretched, its claws glinting in the lamplight. I stumbled backward, tripping over the threshold, the lamp falling from my grasp and shattering on the porch. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the stove. I scrambled to my feet, my mind reeling. I could hear the creature moving inside the cabin, its heavy footsteps shaking the floorboards. I had to get out of there. I crawled towards the back window, the one I usually used to air out the cabin. It was small, but it was my only hope. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers numb with fear. Finally, it gave way, and I squeezed through, dropping to the ground below. I didn't waste any time. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back. The creature's screeches echoed behind me, getting closer, closer. I could feel its breath on my neck, its claws reaching for me. I stumbled, fell, got up, and kept running. The woods were a blur of trees and shadows, the path ahead barely visible in the darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. Away from the cabin, away from the creature, away from the terror that had consumed me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. The faint glow of my truck's headlights, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I reached the truck, fumbled with the keys, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck roared to life, fishtailing wildly as I sped away from the cabin, away from the nightmare that had unfolded there. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing after me, its grotesque form illuminated in the headlights. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty road behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, several hours away. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my body shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs barely able to hold me up. The gas station attendant, a young guy with bored eyes and a name tag that read Mike, looked at me with a mixture of concern and annoyance. "You all right, man?" he asked, his voice flat. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I just stared at him, unable to speak. I wanted to tell him about the cabin, about the creature, about the terror I had experienced. But the words caught in my throat. Who would believe me? I mumbled something about getting lost in the woods, paid for the gas, and got back in my truck. I drove home. The image of the creature seared into my mind. The drive home was a blur. I remember the sun rising, casting a pale light over the landscape, but it did nothing to dispel the darkness that had settled within me. Every shadow, every noise made me jump. I was a wreck, a shell of the man I had been just a few days before. When I finally pulled into my driveway, Sarah ran out of the house, her face etched with worry. She had been calling my name. She said, her voice thick with emotion, but all she got was straight to voicemail. She'd been about to call the sheriff. She enveloped me in a hug, and I just stood there numb, unable to return the embrace. The kids came out next, excited to see me, but I could barely muster a smile. "Daddy, you're back," my youngest Lily chirped, tugging at my leg. I knelt down and forced a smile. "Hey, sweet pea, Daddy's home." But I wasn't really home. Not yet. Part of me was still back in that cabin, trapped in that nightmare. The next few days were a haze. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but it was impossible. I couldn't sleep, haunted by the image of the creature, its screech echoing in my ears. I couldn't eat, the thought of food making me nauseous. I was jumpy, constantly on edge, flinching at every sudden movement or noise. Sarah tried to understand, tried to help, but how could she? How could anyone who hadn't experienced what I had experienced possibly comprehend the terror, the sheer, unadulterated fear that had taken root inside me? I started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams where I was back in the cabin, the creature lurking just outside, its eyes burning into me. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, gasping for air. I tried to talk to Sarah about it, to explain what I had seen, but the words always seemed to fall short. How do you describe something that defies logic, something that shouldn't exist but does? It was like something out of a horror movie, I stammered. But it was real, Sarah. It was so real. She would listen patiently, holding my hand, her eyes filled with concern. But I could see the doubt in her eyes. I could see the questions she didn't ask. Was I sure? Was I exaggerating? Was it just stress? And the truth was, I started to doubt myself too. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a bear or a trick of the light. Maybe the isolation, the stress of the hunt had gotten to me. But then I would remember the feeling of pure terror, the stench of the creature, the way it moved, the look in its eyes, and I knew deep down that it was real. It had to be. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to put the experience behind me. I threw myself into work, hoping to distract myself from the memories. I spent more time with my family, trying to reconnect with the life I had almost lost. But the scars remained. I still couldn't go into the woods alone. I avoided being out after dark. I found myself constantly checking the locks on the doors, peering out the windows, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The wooden figure I had found near the cairn stayed hidden in a box in my closet, a constant reminder of the terror I had faced. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't look at it either. It was a tangible piece of the nightmare, a physical manifestation of the fear that still lingered within me. One evening, a few weeks after my return, Sarah came to me with a worried look on her face. "Caleb," she said softly, "I think you need to talk to someone, a professional, I mean. This isn't going away on its own." I knew she was right. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of fear and paranoia. I needed help. So I started seeing a therapist, a kindly old woman named Dr. Evans, who specialized in trauma. It wasn't easy, opening up about my experience, reliving the terror in those sessions. But slowly, gradually, it started to help. Dr. Evans didn't dismiss my story as a hallucination or a delusion. She listened patiently, offering support and understanding. She helped me process the trauma, to understand the impact it had had on me. What you experienced was real to you, Caleb," she said one day. "It doesn't matter if it was a real creature or a figment of your imagination. The fear you felt was real, and that's what we need to address." Through therapy, I learned coping mechanisms to deal with the anxiety and the nightmares. I started to regain some semblance of control over my life. But the questions still lingered. What was that creature? Why was it there? And why had it come after? I started doing research, delving into local legends and folklore, searching for anything that could explain what I had. I spent hours online reading stories of strange creatures and unexplained phenomena in the Appalachian Mountains. I found tales of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that possessed humans and drove them to cannibalism. I read about the skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures that could take the form of animals or humans. I stumbled upon accounts of the Cherokee Death Cat and various local variations of the boogeyman. But none of it quite matched what I had seen. The creature I encountered was different, something other. One day, while browsing an online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, I came across a post that caught my eye. It was a story from a hiker who had gotten lost in the same area where my family cabin was located. He described seeing strange symbols carved into trees, piles of rocks arranged in odd patterns, and a feeling of being watched. He also mentioned finding a small wooden figure, similar to the one I had found. He described it as having a humanoid shape, with exaggerated features and a disturbing aura. He said he had left it where he found it, not wanting to disturb whatever energy it might possess. The hiker's story sent a chill down my spine. It was too similar to my own experience to be a coincidence. It confirmed that I wasn't alone, that others had encountered something strange in those woods. I reached out to the hiker, sending him a private message. We started corresponding, sharing our stories, comparing notes. It was a relief to finally talk to someone who understood, someone who didn't think I was crazy. He told me he had done some research of his own, and he believed that what we had encountered was something ancient, something that had been in those woods long before the first settlers arrived. He called it a forest spirit, a guardian of the woods, angered by the encroachment of humans. His theory made a strange kind of sense. The area around my family cabin had always been considered sacred by the local Native American tribes. They believed it was a place of power, a place to be respected and feared. Maybe the creature was a manifestation of that power, a protector of the woods, angered by my presence, by the intrusion of the modern world into its ancient domain. The correspondence with the hiker, whose name was Mark, became a lifeline for me. We exchanged emails almost daily, sharing our research, our theories, and our fears. It was through Mark that I learned about a local historian, an old woman named Elsie who lived in a small town not far from where my cabin was located. Elsie was known for her vast knowledge of the region's history and folklore, particularly the Native American legends. Mark suggested that I reach out to Elsie, that she might be able to shed some light on what we had encountered. I was hesitant at first. Part of me wanted to leave the past buried, to move on with my life and forget about the creature in the woods. But another part, a deeper, more insistent part, needed answers. So one Saturday morning, I drove to the town where Elsie lived. It was a small, quiet place, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were met with a healthy dose of suspicion. I found Elsie's house, a small, unassuming cottage with a porch swing and a garden full of herbs and flowers. Elsie answered the door, a woman who looked as though she had been carved from the very mountains themselves. Her face was weathered and lined, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She wore her gray hair in a long braid down her back, and her hands, gnarled with age, were clasped in front of her. "Can I help you, son?" she asked, her voice raspy but strong. I introduced myself and explained that I was interested in learning more about the history of the area, particularly the land around my family's cabin. Elsie studied me for a moment, her eyes seeming to peer into my soul. Then she nodded slowly. "Come in, Caleb," she said. "I've been expecting you." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. How could she have known I was coming? Inside, Elsie's house was filled with books, maps, and artifacts. It was like stepping into a museum, a repository of the region's past. She led me to a small table by the window, where a pot of tea was already steeping. We sat down and I told her my story. I told her about the hunting trip, the cairn, the wooden figure, and the creature. I told her about the fear, the nightmares, and the lingering sense of dread. Elsie listened patiently, her eyes never leaving mine. When I was finished, she remained silent for a long time, sipping her tea, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "The old ones are restless," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been disturbed." She went on to tell me about the history of the land where my cabin was located. She spoke of the Cherokee who had lived there for centuries, their deep connection to the land, and their respect for the spirits that resided in the mountains and forests. She told me that the area around my cabin was considered sacred, a place of power where the veil between the physical world and the spirit world was thin. It was a place where the old ones, the ancient spirits of the land, still held sway. "The cairn you found," Elsie said. "It was a warning, a marker to keep people away. And the figure, it was a representation of the one who guards that place." She explained that the creature I had encountered was not a monster, not a demon, but a protector, a guardian of the sacred land. It was a being of immense power, tasked with keeping outsiders away, with protecting the balance of nature. "The Cherokee had many names for it," she said. "They called it the Forest Keeper, the Mountain Watcher, the Silent Hunter. They feared it, yes, but they also respected it. They understood that it was a part of the natural order, a force to be reckoned with." Elsie's words resonated with me, echoing the theory that Mark had shared. It made sense. The creature hadn't attacked me unprovoked. It had warned me, given me a chance to leave. It was only when I persisted, when I intruded further into its domain, that it had become aggressive. "Why me?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. "Why did it come after me?" Elsie looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. "You went looking for something, Caleb," she said, "and you found it. You disturbed the balance, and the forest reacted. It's not personal, son. It's just the way of things." Her explanation, while unsettling, brought a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the answer I had expected, but it was an answer nonetheless. It gave a name, a purpose, to the creature that had haunted my nightmares. I stayed with Elsie for several more hours, listening to her stories, learning about the history and folklore of the region. I realized that the creature was not an anomaly, not an aberration, but a part of a larger, more ancient tapestry. As the sun began to set, I thanked Elsie for her time and prepared to leave. "One more thing, Caleb," she said, stopping me at the door. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Take this. It's a mixture of herbs gathered from the sacred ground. It's a peace offering, a way to show respect." I took the pouch, the scent of sage and cedar filling the air. "What do I do with it?" I asked. "Return to the place where you found the figure," Elsie said. "Leave the pouch there along with the wooden carving. Ask for forgiveness, and then leave that place. Never return." I nodded, understanding dawning on me. This was my chance to make amends, to restore the balance I had disrupted. The next day, I drove back to the woods. I didn't go to the cabin. Instead, I went to the clearing where I had found the cairn and the wooden figure. The clearing was just as I remembered it, quiet, still, and filled with an almost palpable sense of energy. The cairn stood undisturbed, a silent sentinel in the center of the clearing. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I placed the pouch of herbs at the base of the cairn, along with the wooden figure. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. "I didn't understand. Please forgive me." I stood there for a moment, my eyes closed, listening to the silence of the woods. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling of release. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Then, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I never returned to that place again. I sold the cabin, severing my ties to the land that had brought me so much terror and ultimately so much understanding. I still have nightmares sometimes, but they're less frequent now, less intense. The fear still lingers, but it no longer controls me. I've come to accept that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that defy logic and reason. There are places where the veil between worlds is thin, where the old ones still hold sway. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to respect those places, to heed the warnings, and to leave them in peace. The experience changed me. It made me more aware of the power of nature, the importance of respecting the unknown, and the fragility of the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary. I still think about the creature sometimes, about its haunting eyes and its terrifying screech, but I no longer see it as a monster. I see it as a guardian, a protector, a reminder that there are forces in this world beyond our comprehension. And in a strange way, I'm grateful for the experience. It taught me a valuable lesson, a lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my life. A lesson about the power of the wild, the importance of respect, and the enduring presence of the unknown. And there you have it, another chilling tale from the backwoods of America. Caleb's story is a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, and sometimes the most terrifying encounters happen in the most ordinary of places. What did you think of this one? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have a true scary story of your own you would like to share, don't hesitate to reach out. Remember to like, subscribe, and as always, keep those lights on. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. My family has this tradition. Every summer we rent a cabin somewhere remote, somewhere far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It's our way of reconnecting, of unplugging from technology and enjoying the simple things. We've been doing this for years, ever since my kids, now teenagers, were little. This particular year, 2021, we found a place in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a cabin nestled deep in the woods near Lake Superior. It was advertised as a rustic retreat, perfect for hiking, fishing, and just getting away from it all. The pictures online showed a cozy little cabin in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines, with a view of the lake in the distance. It looked idyllic, exactly what we were looking for. We packed up our SUV, my husband, Mark, our two kids, Emily and Ben, and me, and made the long drive north. It was late July, the height of summer, and the weather was perfect. Sunny days, cool nights, and that fresh, pine-scented air that just makes you feel alive. The drive to the cabin was an adventure in itself. We left the main highway, then turned onto a series of increasingly smaller roads, each one more remote than the last. Finally, we were on a narrow, rutted dirt track that seemed to disappear into the dense forest. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked Mark, a little uneasy. "Relax, honey," he said, grinning. "It's all part of the adventure." After about half an hour of bumping along this barely there road, we finally arrived at the clearing. And there it was, the cabin. Just like in the pictures, it was a small log cabin with a porch that wrapped around the front and a stone chimney rising from the roof. It looked charming, inviting, and just a little bit isolated. We unloaded the car, eager to start our vacation. The kids ran around, exploring the clearing, while Mark and I began unpacking. The cabin was rustic, as advertised, but comfortable. It had a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 tiny bedrooms. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, just the basics. Perfect. The first few days were blissful. We hiked through the woods, swam in the lake, and spent our evenings playing board games by the light of kerosene lamps. It was exactly the kind of relaxing family time we had been craving. But then, things started to change. It began with small things things that were easy to dismiss at first. We'd hear strange noises at night, rustlings in the woods just beyond the clearing. Sounds that didn't quite match any animal we knew. Probably just raccoons, Mark said, but I wasn't so sure. Then there were the shadows. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that seemed to dart behind trees or disappear around the corner of the cabin. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Mom, you're being paranoid," Emily said, rolling her eyes. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just letting the isolation get to me. But the unease continued to grow. One afternoon, while hiking on a trail near the cabin, we came across a strange symbol carved into a tree. It was a circle with a series of lines radiating outwards, like a stylized sun. It looked old, weathered, but definitely man-made. "What do you think it means?" Ben asked, tracing the symbol with his finger. "I don't know," I said, a shiver running down my spine. "Maybe some kind of Native American symbol?" We took a picture of it, intending to look it up later, but we never got the chance. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting around the fireplace, playing a game of cards, when we heard a loud thud from outside. It sounded like something heavy had fallen against the side of the cabin. Mark grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate. He was gone for a few minutes, and when he came back, his face was pale. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "There's nothing there, but I found something." He held out his hand. In his palm was a small, smooth stone about the size of a quarter. It was dark gray, almost black, and it seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. "Where did you find it?" I asked, taking the stone from him. It felt strangely warm to the touch. "Just outside the door," he said. It was lying on the ground. We examined the stone, turning it over in our hands, but we couldn't figure out what it was or where it had come from. It didn't look like any rock we had ever seen before. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside sounded like a threat. I lay in bed, listening to the silence, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something from the woods. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave. We hadn't planned on cutting our vacation short, but the unsettling events of the previous night had spooked us. We were all on edge, eager to get back to civilization, back to the safety of our normal lives. As we were loading the car, I noticed something on the ground near the porch. It was another one of those strange stones, just like the one Mark had found the night before. I picked it up, my hand trembling. "Look," I said to Mark, showing him the stone. "There's another one." He took the stone from me, his face grim. "Let's just get out of here," he said. We finished packing, got in the car, and started driving away from the cabin, away from the clearing, away from the unsettling feeling that had settled over us like a shroud. As we drove, I looked back at the cabin, a small dark shape in the distance. And for a moment I thought I saw something moving in the trees, a fleeting shadow watching us leave. The drive back was tense and silent. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we had experienced. The kids, who had initially dismissed my concerns as paranoia, were now visibly shaken. Even Mark, always the rational one, seemed disturbed. "What do you think it was?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. Mark just shook his head. "I don't know, Sarah. I really don't know. But it wasn't natural, that's for sure." We stopped for lunch at a small diner along the way, hoping to regain some sense of normalcy. But even the familiar surroundings, the chatter of other customers, the smell of coffee and greasy food, did little to ease the unease that had settled over us. As we ate, I pulled out the 2 stones we had found. I placed them on the table, turning them over in my hands, examining them under the fluorescent lights of the diner. They were still just as strange, just as unsettling, as they had been at the cabin. "Maybe we should show these to someone," I said. "Someone who knows about rocks or, I don't know, Native American artifacts." "Maybe you're right," Mark said. There's a natural history museum in town. We can stop there on the way home." After lunch, we continued our drive, the stones a constant, silent presence in the car. We reached our town in the late afternoon and went straight to the museum. We found a geologist on staff, a young woman named Dr. Miller, and showed her the stones. She examined them carefully, turning them over in her hands, holding them up to the light. "These are unusual," she said, frowning. "I've never seen anything quite like them. They're not native to this area, as far as I know." She took some measurements, did some tests, and then shook her head. "I can't identify them," she said. "They're some kind of igneous rock, but the composition is off. There are trace elements I can't account for, and the way they absorb and emit light, it's strange." Her words only deepened the mystery. We left the museum feeling even more confused and unsettled than before. The following days were filled with a growing sense of dread. We tried to go back to our normal routines, but it was impossible. The experience at the cabin had changed us. We were jumpy, on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders. And the stones, they seemed to be the focal point of the strange occurrences that continued to plague us. We started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams filled with dark shapes, strange symbols, and the feeling of being watched. We'd hear noises in the house at night, whispers in the dark, footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. Objects would move on their own, disappearing and reappearing in different places. "It's like we brought something back with us," I said to Mark one night, unable to sleep. "Something from the cabin." Mark, who had initially been skeptical, was now starting to believe. He had experienced the strange occurrences too, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched. "Maybe we should get rid of the stones," he said. "Maybe they're, I don't know, a conduit or something." It was a terrifying thought, the idea that these small, innocuous-looking stones could be the source of the evil that had invaded our lives. But we couldn't bring ourselves to just throw them away. They were a link to the mystery, a tangible piece of the puzzle. We decided to do some research, to try to find out more about the area where the cabin was located, the history of the land, the local legends. We spent hours online, searching for anything that could explain what we had experienced. We found stories of strange disappearances in the area, tales of people who had gone into the woods and never returned. We read about the Anishinaabe, the Native American tribe who had originally inhabited the land, and their beliefs about the spirits that resided in the forests and lakes. We learned about a particular legend, a story about a creature called the Managishi, a being that lived in the water and played tricks on humans. The legend described the Managishi as mischievous, but also potentially dangerous, especially to those who disrespected the land. The more we read, the more convinced we became that what we had encountered at the cabin was something connected to these ancient legends, something that had been there long before the first European settlers arrived. One evening, while browsing an online forum dedicated to paranormal phenomena, I came across a post that caught my eye. It was from a user who claimed to have had a similar experience in the same area where our cabin was located. He described finding strange stones, hearing unsettling noises, and feeling like he was being watched. He said he had eventually fled the area, but the experience had stayed with him, haunting his dreams. I reached out to the user, sending him a private message. He responded quickly, and we began to correspond, sharing our stories, comparing notes. It was a relief to finally talk to someone who understood, someone who didn't think I was crazy. He told me he had done some research of his own, and he believed that the stones were a kind of focal point for the energy of the area, a way for the spirits to interact with the physical world. He suggested that we try to return the stones to where we found them, to appease whatever we had disturbed. It was a long shot, but we were desperate. We had to try something. The decision to return to the cabin was not made lightly. We were terrified, but we also felt like we had no other choice. The strange occurrences had become more frequent, more intense. We were living in a constant state of fear, and we knew we couldn't go on like this. So we packed up the car again, this time with a sense of dread hanging over us like a dark cloud. We told the kids we were going on a short trip, a chance to make things right with the place we had visited before. They were apprehensive, but they trusted us. The drive back to the Upper Peninsula was even more unsettling than the first time. We were all on edge, every shadow, every noise, seeming to hold a hidden meaning. The closer we got to the cabin, the stronger the feeling of unease became. We arrived at the clearing in the late afternoon. The cabin stood just as we had left it, silent and ominous in the fading light. It looked even more menacing now, the shadows around it deeper, the silence around it more profound. "Are we sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We have to try," I said, though my own voice was far from steady. We got out of the car, the 2 stones heavy in my pocket. We walked towards the cabin, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. We stopped at the edge of the porch, the same spot where Mark had found the first stone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "What do we do now?" Ben asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "We put the stones back," I said. "We try to show whatever is here that we're sorry." I took the stones out of my pocket, their surfaces seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. I knelt down and placed them on the ground, side by side, near the edge of the porch. "We're sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We didn't mean to disturb you. Please let us go." We stood there for a moment, waiting, listening. The silence was deafening. Nothing happened. "Maybe that's it," Mark said, a glimmer of hope in his voice. "Maybe it's over." But just as he spoke, a low growl echoed from the woods behind the cabin. It was a deep, guttural sound, unlike anything we had ever heard before. It sent shivers down our spines. We turned towards the sound, our hearts pounding in our chests. We could see nothing in the dense undergrowth, but we could feel it, a presence, something watching us from the shadows. Then we heard it again, the growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the trees. It was coming towards us. "We need to go," I said, panic rising in my voice. "Now." We turned and ran back towards the car, not daring to look back. We could hear the creature, or whatever it was, moving through the woods, getting closer, closer. We scrambled into the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, and the engine roared to life. We sped away from the cabin, the tires spitting gravel, not stopping until we were far, far away from that cursed clearing. As we drove, we kept looking back, half expecting to see something pursuing us, some dark shape emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind us. We didn't stop driving until we were well out of the Upper Peninsula, back in the familiar landscape of the Lower Peninsula. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. When we finally got home, we felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The strange occurrences didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. The nightmares became more vivid, more terrifying. We would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the feeling of being watched stronger than ever. The noises in the house became more frequent, more insistent. We would hear footsteps, whispers, scratching sounds coming from the walls. Objects would move on their own, sometimes violently, thrown across the room by an unseen force. One night, we were awakened by a loud crash from downstairs. We rushed down to find the living room in disarray. Furniture was overturned, books were scattered across the floor, and the 2 stones we had left at the cabin were sitting on the coffee table, glowing faintly. That was the breaking point. We couldn't take it anymore. We were being tormented, driven to the edge of madness. We decided to seek help, to find someone who could explain what was happening to us, someone who could help us stop it. We contacted a paranormal investigator, a man named Robert who had a reputation for dealing with difficult cases. Robert came to our house, listened to our story, and examined the evidence we had gathered. He walked through the house with various instruments, taking readings, looking for any sign of paranormal activity. "You've definitely got something here," he said, his face grim. "Something powerful, and it's attached to these." He pointed to the 2 stones which were now sitting on our kitchen counter, pulsating with that eerie, inner light. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What have we brought into our home?" Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's hard to say for sure, but based on your story and the energy readings I'm getting, I believe you've disturbed something ancient, something connected to the land where you found these stones." He explained that the stones were likely a conduit, a way for the entity to interact with our world. He said that by taking the stones, we had inadvertently invited the entity into our home, given it a foothold in our lives. "Can you get rid of it?" Mark asked, desperation in his voice. "Can you make it stop?" Robert was silent for a moment, considering. "I can try," he said finally, "but it won't be easy. This entity is strong and it's been feeding off your fear. It's going to take a lot to break its hold on you." Robert, the paranormal investigator, explained his plan. He needed to perform a ritual, a cleansing of sorts, to sever the connection between our family and the entity, and to force it back to where it came from. He warned us that it would be dangerous, that the entity would likely resist, and that we needed to be prepared for anything. We were terrified, but we also knew that we had no other choice. We were desperate to end the torment, to reclaim our lives. Robert began his preparations. He asked us to gather any objects that had been affected by the entity's presence, things that had moved on their own, or that held a particular significance to the events. We brought him the 2 stones, of course, along with a few other items. A book that had flown off a shelf, a picture frame that had shattered on its own, a child's toy that had been found in strange places. Robert arranged the objects in a circle on the living room floor. He placed the 2 stones in the center, their faint glow illuminating the room with an eerie light. He then began to draw symbols around the circle, using a mixture of salt and herbs. The symbols, he explained, were ancient protective sigils designed to contain and repel negative energy. As he worked, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The air grew heavy, the temperature dropped, and a low hum filled the air. The entity was aware of what was happening. It was resisting. Once the preparations were complete, Robert instructed us to stand outside the circle. He told us to hold hands, to stay strong, and to focus on positive thoughts, on our love for each other, on our desire to be free from the entity's grasp. Then he began the ritual. He started chanting in a low, guttural voice, a language we didn't understand but that seemed to resonate with the very air around us. The stones in the center of the circle began to glow brighter, pulsating with an intense, almost blinding light. The room grew colder, the humming grew louder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, to writhe and twist as if they were alive. We could feel the entity's presence, its anger, its rage, directed at us, at Robert, at anyone who dared to challenge its hold. Suddenly, objects in the room began to shake. Picture frames rattled on the walls, books flew off shelves, and the furniture trembled as if caught in an earthquake. A cold wind swept through the room despite the closed windows, carrying with it the stench of decay, of something ancient and foul. We clung to each other, our hands clasped tightly, our eyes fixed on Robert, who continued to chant, his voice rising above the chaos. Then the entity manifested. It appeared in the center of the circle above the glowing stones, a swirling vortex of darkness, a shapeless mass of shadow and rage. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, but we could feel its presence, its malevolence, its desire to destroy. It let out a deafening screech, a sound that seemed to pierce our very souls, a sound that promised pain and oblivion. The house shook violently. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. broken only by the eerie glow of the stones and the swirling vortex of the entity. Robert continued to chant, his voice strained but unwavering. He raised his hands towards the entity, and a bright light emanated from his palms, pushing back against the darkness. The battle had begun. It was a clash between light and darkness, between good and evil, between the will of a man and the power of an ancient entity. The room was filled with a cacophony of sounds, the screeching of the entity, the chanting of Robert, the crashing of objects, the creaking of the house as it strained under the strain of the unseen forces. We could only watch, helpless, as the battle raged around us. We were caught in the crossfire, our fate hanging in the balance. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The entity let out one final, agonizing shriek, and the vortex of darkness began to shrink, to collapse in on itself. The stones dimmed, their glow fading, until they were just ordinary rocks once more. The room fell silent, the only sound our ragged breathing and the beating of our hearts. Robert stood in the center of the circle, his body slumped, his face pale and drawn. He looked exhausted, drained, but there was a look of triumph in his eyes. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's gone." We didn't know what to say. We were in shock, numb from the ordeal we had just witnessed. Slowly, we began to pick up the pieces, to try to restore some semblance of order to our shattered home. As we worked, we noticed a change in the atmosphere. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The nightmares stopped, the noises ceased, the feeling of being watched disappeared. Our lives, slowly but surely, returned to normal. But we were never the same. The experience had changed us, had left an indelible mark on our souls. We had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. We sold the house, moved to a new city, started over. We never spoke about what happened, not to anyone. It was our secret, our burden to bear. The 2 stones remained in our possession, locked away in a safe, a constant reminder of the terror we had faced. We couldn't bring ourselves to destroy them, nor could we bear to look at them. They were a tangible link to a past we wanted to forget but could never escape. Years later, we're still haunted by what happened. We still have questions that will likely never be answered. What was that entity? Where did it come from? And why did it choose us? We'll never know for sure. But we learned a valuable lesson, a lesson about the power of the unknown, the fragility of our reality, and the enduring presence of the past. There are things in this world that we don't understand, forces that we can't control, and sometimes the best we can do is to respect them, to leave them undisturbed, and to pray that they never find their way into our lives. The memory of the cabin, the stones, and the entity remains with us, a chilling reminder that the world is a far stranger and more terrifying place than we could ever imagine, and that sometimes the greatest horrors are not found in the shadows, but in the places we think are safe, in the places we call home. And that's it, another chilling true story from the backwoods. Sarah's experience is a stark reminder that there are places in this world, even in our own homes, where the veil between the known and the unknown is thin. What did you make of this one? Did it send shivers down your spine? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you have a true scary story of your own to share, don't hesitate to reach out. Until next time, sleep tight, keep those lights on, and remember, you're never truly alone. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Lights On, the channel where we bring you the eeriest, spine-chilling tales straight from the depths of human experience. Tonight, we have a special submission from a viewer who shared a harrowing encounter that took place deep in the backwoods of America. What starts as a simple weekend getaway quickly spirals into something out of a nightmare. Buckle up, keep the lights on, and remember you never know what's waiting in the shadows. It all started with an email. Our viewer Jake wrote in to share his story, one that he says still keeps him awake some nights. Jake lives a quiet life in suburban Ohio, working a regular 9-to-5 job. But last summer, he decided to break away from the routine and plan a solo trip to the Appalachian backwoods. "I've always loved hiking," Jake wrote. "The quiet, the solitude, it's where I feel most at peace." That peace, however, would soon be shattered. Jake had booked a small off-grid cabin in West Virginia, miles away from the nearest town. The photos on the rental site showed a quaint little place nestled among towering pines, with a fire pit and a wraparound porch. It was exactly what Jake was looking for, a chance to unplug, recharge, and spend a weekend surrounded by nature. I packed like just the essentials: hiking gear, a few meals, and my trusty headlamp. The drive out there took about 5 hours, and as I got closer, the cell service bars on my phone started dropping one by one until there was nothing but no signal on the screen. Then there were the shadows. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that seemed to dart behind trees or disappear around the corner of the cabin. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Mom, you're being paranoid," Emily said, rolling her eyes. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just letting the isolation get to me. But the unease continued to grow. One afternoon, while hiking on a trail near the cabin, we came across a strange symbol carved into a tree. It was a circle with a series of lines radiating outwards, like a stylized sun. It looked old, weathered, but definitely man-made. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from some distant chimney, probably another old-timer like me, getting ready for the long night. I unloaded my gear, started a fire in the stove, and settled in. The first night was peaceful. I ate a simple dinner, read a few chapters of an old Western novel by the light of a kerosene lamp, and fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, eager to get out into the woods. I brewed some coffee on the stove, strong enough to wake the dead, and stepped out onto the porch. The valley below was shrouded in mist, the trees like ghostly sentinels in the pre-dawn light. It was beautiful, serene, but there was also something different. A stillness that felt a little too still, a silence that was a little too quiet. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. A little bit of nerves was to be expected. I grabbed my rifle, checked the sights. Jake's sleep was restless. He kept waking up to faint noises, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind through the cracks in the cabin walls. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps on the porch. I told myself it was my imagination, but when I got up to check, my heart sank. The rocking chair on the porch was moving. The chair swayed gently back and forth, even though the night air was still. Jake scanned the clearing with his flashlight but saw nothing. He locked the door again and double-checked the windows before crawling back into bed. The next day, Jake decided to clear his head with a long hike. He packed a small bag and set off into the woods, following a trail that looped through the dense forest. The hike was uneventful at first, but a few hours in, Jake stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. There was a campsite, but it didn't look right. The tent was shredded, the fabric hanging in tatters. There was a fire pit, but the ashes were scattered, like someone had stomped it out in a hurry. Nearby, Jake found a backpack lying on its side, its contents spilling out onto the ground clothes, a flashlight, and a water bottle. I called out, "Hello, anyone here?" But there was no answer. The weirdest part was the carvings on the trees around the campsite. They were these strange symbols like spirals and jagged lines, all etched into the bark. Jake took a few photos on his phone, though he knew he wouldn't be able to send them until he got back to civilization. The whole scene felt off, and Jake decided to head back to the cabin before it got dark. That night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder and closer, coming from just outside the cabin walls. I was lying in bed, frozen. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Jake's heart pounded as he grabbed the hatchet he'd brought for chopping firewood. He crept toward the door, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a gunshot in the silence. When he peeked through the window, his breath caught. There was a man standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light. He was tall and thin, wearing some kind of hood or cloak. I couldn't see his face. The man didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at the cabin. Jake backed away from the window and waited, his heart hammering in his chest. Minutes passed, then hours, but the man didn't leave. I don't know how I fell asleep, but when I woke up, he was gone. The only sign he'd been there was a single spiral carved into the cabin door. Jake stared at the spiral etched into the door, his pulse racing. The carving was fresh, tiny curls of wood still clung to the gouges, and it hadn't been there the night before. He wrestled with the urge to leave immediately, but convinced himself to wait until morning. I didn't want to risk driving down that narrow dirt road in the dark, Jake wrote. Plus, part of me was hoping it was just some creepy prank. Still, he knew he couldn't stay inside the cabin. Every creak and groan of the old wood made his skin crawl. Armed with the hatchet, he sat by the fire pit outside, keeping his flashlight and a mug of coffee close. The night was unnervingly quiet, no crickets, no wind, just the crackle of the fire and Jake's own breathing. By dawn, Jake had made up his mind to leave. He packed his gear in record time, making sure to stay hyper-aware of his surroundings. As he loaded his car, he glanced toward the edge of the clearing and noticed something he'd missed the night before, a trail of disturbed leaves leading into the woods. It looked like someone or something had dragged something heavy through the underbrush, he explained. Against his better judgment, Jake decided to follow the trail. The path wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser with each step. It was like the forest was swallowing me whole, Jake wrote. Even though it was broad daylight, the canopy was so thick that it felt like dusk. After about 20 minutes, the trail ended abruptly in another clearing. In the center stood a large moss-covered rock with a spiral carved deeply into its surface. It was the same spiral that had been on my cabin door, Jake noted. Surrounding the rock were small, crude figurines made of sticks and twine. Some were hanging from the trees, others were placed in a circle around the stone. Jake's stomach churned. It was like something out of a horror movie. I didn't stick around to figure out what it all meant. I turned and ran back to the cabin. Jake jumped into his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the clearing, the dirt road kicking up a cloud of dust behind him. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. The narrow, winding road seemed to stretch on forever. With no cell service and no GPS, Jake relied on his memory to navigate back to the main road. About 10 minutes into the drive, I saw something in my rearview mirror, a figure standing in the middle of the road, far behind me. It was the same man from the clearing, just standing there, watching. Jake pressed the gas pedal harder, his tires skidding on the loose gravel. As he rounded a bend, he caught a glimpse of something else, another spiral, this time painted in bright red on a tree trunk by the side of the road. I started seeing them everywhere, Jake wrote. On trees, on rocks, even on the ground. It was like the forest was alive, mocking me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake finally reached the paved road leading back to civilization. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. I stopped at a gas station to fill up and get some food. When I went inside, the cashier gave me a weird look and asked if I'd been out near the woods. Jake nodded, not wanting to go into detail. She leaned in close and said, "You need to be careful out there. People go missing in those woods all the time." Jake didn't respond, but the words lingered in his mind as he got back into his car. It wasn't until he was halfway home that he noticed the final detail. There was something in my back seat, a small, twisted figurine made of sticks and twine, just like the ones I'd seen at the clearing. Jake ended his email with a chilling admission. "I burned the figurine as soon as I got home, but I swear I can still feel it watching me. Some nights, I hear tapping at my windows even though I live in the middle of a suburb. I don't know what followed me out of those woods, but I know it's not done with me. What do you think? Did Jake stumble into something supernatural, or was it all an elaborate hoax? Whatever the truth may be, one thing is clear: the backwoods of America hold secrets we may never fully understand.